This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Getting the show started is Elliott Dennis, University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist, as he chats about feeder cattle, packer economics, and what else is impacting cattle prices. Sarah Ganske, K-State weed specialist, keeps the show rolling as she discusses pokeweed in fields and what soybean growers need to keep in mind with herbicides and growth stage. K-State fisheries and aquatics extension specialist Joe Gerken in today's show as he explains what pond turnover is and how it can be noticed. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. Elliott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Elliott, looking at the cattle market, how are things looking for feeder cattle?
Yeah, feeder cattle had a pretty significant sell-off this past week for the CME futures. Some of the cash sales were holding strong. We dipped a little bit on the feeder cattle index towards the end of the week, and just kind of this mounting pressure that we're seeing all along the supply chain, starting from consumers all the way down to the processing industry and then into the feedlots, and then ultimately that's passed down into the feeder cattle segment. And really we're seeing kind of just broad-based kind of weakening in that market. So it's not really regionally specific, but we're just kind of seeing just broad-based kind of pressure generally across all the contracts. We were down about $11 a hundredweight and larger sell-offs than we were in the live cattle market.
Was this past week for processors and packers shorter than usual?
Yeah, so this week, obviously, or this past week, we had the 4th of July weekend. In addition, since the 4th was on Saturday, we had a lot of people had given the 3rd off, and even a lot of businesses were running a little bit shorter, even on the 2nd, like half days. And so that has really affected a lot of numbers. And we were already running pretty tight on numbers for cattle, just because, as we all know, there's fewer numbers out there, but also from a packer standpoint, if they're losing $200 a head on average every time an animal grows across the scale, there's a pretty large incentive there not to want to process more animals. And so there is some reshifting and redistributing on how many animals we need to process. And even though we've made it up a little bit with tons for total beef production, there is tonnage plus, total head that's being processed. And so one of the benefits of kind of this increased tonnage has really been just increase in quality of grading of cattle. A lot of that has to do with just extended days on feed. And I know that was some of the highlights from the last cattle on feed report, but that's helped to kind of cattle quality grading, which of course in the summer it's great because we want high choice animals as we start to get into growing months. But now that the 4th of July is past, we're kind of on the downhill slope into Labor Day, and so we've kind of reached peaked grilling season. And really what that means is we're going to have some potential weakness in the rib and the loin, which tends to be kind of that primary meats that we tend to think of for summer. So all of that's, really kind of, hampered some of that, cutout value.
For cutout value, how are things looking?
Yeah, so we had a pretty big run up in February and March, a little bit sooner, and then we kind of peaked, and it's kind of come down to this about 390 per hundredweight range. And normally we'd see quite a bit of movement starting in that, really, I'd say kind of late February, early March, and just kind of has the continually stepped up, a little bit past the 4th of July. It is generally the typical seasonal movement. But really, we had a pretty flat market the last, 4 to 6 weeks. The cutout really hasn't changed a lot. And some of that was because some of the retailers had quite a few forward buying purchases, which essentially means that they were trying to anticipate the demand, and some of them were hedging against, higher beef prices. So let's buy it ahead of time, and so we can price in what we're going to be. But if we had, strong beef demand, normally what would happen is that cutout would continue to kind of push a little bit higher. And the reason why is because that means retailers would have to go into the spot market and buy kind of residual demand that they were seeing from consumers. The fact that they're not going into the spot market to buy kind of residual and that price is just staying at $3.90 indicates that there is some, I guess, resistance from consumers and beef users to actually higher beef prices. And so really, that's a pretty big impact. And when you think about it in terms of just like the other factors that are really affecting consumers at this point, fuel and energy are really the two largest, budget items there. So when you think about just like, think of like ground beef, that they're, a person's exchanging for, a month's worth of gas, it's like $23 a pounds of ground beef per month that they're giving up, and about $12 in ribeye prices or ribeyes. And so, they are making these exchanges in their fixed budget. So they're saying, fuel prices are rising, so I got to reshuffle some of these things. And I think one of the things we're seeing kind of reshuffle into is kind of these different these high protein items.
Do you see that having maybe a chain reaction back through the market?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why we're starting to see a little bit of resistance in the live feeder cattle. That, and, we combine that with, where we're at on the international trade, both on the import and export market. And we're seeing just more of that product stay domestically, which means, maybe we don't need to, produce as many animals or really process them because a lot of that product's either being shipped in or we can't really export it because we have too high a value.
And thinking about that trade, how have we seen New World screwworm not only impact that, but impact the U.S.?
And we think about where we're at. Normally we kind of reach a seasonal high sometime in the summer, but then last year we had kind of a double peak in August. But important to note that that's not likely to happen this year. And the reason why is because that peak was really driven by, Brazilian demand being kind of cut out of the market because we increased tariffs prohibitively on them. And at the time we had the New World screwworm, thought we had it under control. And so we kind of opened up the borders again, and then we closed it in August. And so that kind of spiked prices again. That's unlikely to kind of happen this year. And so those were really kind of policy shocks that drove the market higher, not necessarily underlying fundamentals of the market. It will be interesting to see kind of what we do kind of with the border and how we kind of manage New World screwworm. It's continued to kind of move throughout the United States. The USDA has really gotten ahead of this and had some great maps on just their Animal Plant Health Inspection Services APHIS website, and it's moving. It's moving even northward into Texas, and has progressed from the bottom of Texas into the middle of Texas. So it's moving. Then it's on the move, and so how that ultimately affects and spreads into the market. But are we betting on a supply shock? Are we culling of animals to move prices higher? Or are we focusing kind of on beef demand, which I think we should be focusing on the latter when we're thinking about, prices and setting risk management decisions.
Are there any other factors you see impacting the market right now?
As we kind of talked about before, New World screwworm kind of created an opportunity for Mexico to kind of further refine and develop its not only cattle feeding industry, but meat processing, federally inspection. And that's why we've seen a lot of those cattle that might have been finished out in Texas or New Mexico or Oklahoma feed yards and even some Kansas feed yards, not actually cross the border and were, needed to be fed out in Mexico and then processed in federal, inspected facilities there. We're seeing a lot more of that imported product in form of steaks and other, steaks and, these, ribs and loins, all those being fed and then imported into the United States. Volume is up quite a bit. At the same time, just because the prices have just been risen so much in the United States, that's really made it, cost prohibitive for a lot of people to export a lot of volume. The volume's down quite a bit, but, total value was up because just such high prices. So what that basically says is a lot of that volume that might have left, is staying domestically in the market. So just kind of combining all of those together, really puts a supply drag and is, I think, one of the reasons why we're starting to see a little bit of weakening on the market.
As we're thinking about livestock and the cattle market, was there a recent USDA grant that was announced?
Yeah, the big announcement this past week was on June 30th. Secretary Rollins announced what they were calling the SPUR program, which was strengthening processing for U.S. ranchers, and it's really just to provide temporary support for eligible beef processors. And really, it's when you think about it, it's really about thinking of these small to medium size meat processors, and really they're thinking about kind of strengthening the supply chain. So they really committed a pretty sizable amount. They're saying they're going to provide up to $500 million in payments to eligible entities. And really what they're looking at is first market stabilization. So as we talked about earlier, packers are losing anywhere between that, $200 to $250 a head that every time they're processing. Some of the worry we had a couple weeks ago, a JBS plant shut down in Pennsylvania. And so, if they continue to lose value, they can only do that for so long. And so how do we continue to kind of support this industry and provide, a market where, ranchers and feedlots can actually deliver their product to? And so a lot of that has to do with that. And then it's really just kind of beefing up this product, the USA label program that USDA has really started to promote kind of earlier. So that, in addition to other grants where you can actually build out and apply for grant opportunities, are all things, if you're working with smaller medium processors, to let them be aware of.
Elliott, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing pokeweed and herbicide cutoffs for soybeans with K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
Sarah, pokeweed coming from one of your World of Weeds articles. And what is pokeweed?
Yeah, so pokeweed is basically a perennial weed. It's actually native to North America, but it's something that you don't think about a lot as an agronomic weed, but definitely is something folks probably have seen around in flower beds and such, roadsides, that kind of thing. So pokeweed is, like I said, it's a perennial plant. It has kind of large, fleshy leaves and sort of a red-colored, maroon-colored stem in the undersides of the leaves. Some things about pokeweed that are just kind of interesting. Pokeweed is a poisonous plant. Okay, so cattle won't eat it in general because it is poisonous. But think Depression era, Southern United States, it was very common to be kind of foraged from the roadsides and used as like salad greens. The thing is, you have to know how to boil the leaves. It has to be the young leaves. You got to know how to boil them right and everything like that before it's edible. But yeah, it used to be something that folks would consume.
And you mentioned it being poisonous. Are all parts of it equally poisonous?
The most poisonous part of the plant are actually the roots, where it's storing a lot of the chemicals that the plant produces.
Does it taste bad to livestock then, so we don't have to worry about them eating?
Yeah, right. So livestock are pretty amazing at kind of what they know about grazing, and so yeah, those toxins will give it a bad taste, and they avoid it.
What other name does pokeweed go by?
Another name for pokeweed is inkberry. So one of the ways you have pokeweed around is after the birds eat the seeds, you'll see the reddish purple stain where the berries fall on the ground. And so it can be used for ink. The Native Americans used it to paint things.
Are birds eating the seeds the way that this plant gets moved around?
Yeah, that's the primary way it moves. And so the reason I wrote the article on this, Shelby, is because I got a call from an applicator who was struggling with it in some cornfields, and it started under the power lines, right? And so a lot of times that's where you'll see a new infestation is under power lines, under trees, under places where the birds are going to kind of sit.
What is it looking like this time of year where people could go identify it?
So right now, it's probably going to look a little bit like a small shrub. It's going to have that stem that's going to be sort of maroon or magenta in color. It's going to have several branches at the top, and the leaves are going to be pretty large, kind of egg-shaped leaves, and they're going to have that same kind of magenta stem on them.
So how can people manage or hopefully control this?
So management can be accomplished by any of our kind of systemic broadleaf herbicides. So think dicamba, think 2,4-D, glyphosate. Those are all options. There's some evidence that mesotrione or callisto can have some activity on it. For corn producers, if we think about soybean crops, things like metribuzin or sulfentrazone can also have activity. The thing I think is important to remember with pokeweed, though, is that it is a perennial plant and it does have a pretty extensive root system. And so you can't spray it, once and expect it to be gone. It's going to take multiple applications. If you spray it at the beginning of the season, odds are it's probably going to be able to grow somewhat even during that growing season. So it's definitely, something that we have to think about as sort of a battle of attrition, right? And we just have to outlast that pokeweed and keep coming back with something to try to control it in almost every pass.
And while we're thinking about controlling things, for soybean fields, what do growers need to be taking into consideration?
Yeah, so pretty much every soybean field I've walked in the last probably 7 to 10 days, Shelby, has started flowering. And unfortunately, that is a key growth stage for herbicide application cutoffs. So if we think about kind of our main post-emergence herbicide in soybeans, for me, I think of glufosinate. I think that's probably going on most of our soybean acres at this point in time. And so the cutoff for a glufosinate application or Liberty application to soybeans is before R1, right? So if you read that correctly, once the soybean plants have reached the R1 growth stage, applications of Liberty are no longer on label for that field. 2,4-D is worded a little bit differently, or enlist in the soybean world. That is written as through the R1 growth stage. Okay, so as long as it's still in R1, you can continue to make those herbicide applications. On the other hand, glyphosate has a little bit wider window, and that is through the end of R2. Okay, so as long as it's still flowering, you can continue to apply glyphosate and still be in compliance with the label requirements. Other things that I think folks are applying quite a bit of right now, clethodim. There's a lot of volunteer corn in soybean country this year. The cutoff for clethodim is 60 days before harvest. So there's still some time for that one.
Any reasons as to why you feel like there's a lot of volunteer corn this year in soybeans?
Well, some of it has to do with combine settings and is a little bit of a kind of a perennial problem. But I think we had some diseases come through last summer that resulted in ears that dropped off the plant before the combine got to the field, resulted in light or small kernels that, was just really hard to keep in the combine. And so I think we just had at harvest, we had good conditions to leave a lot of grain in the field. And so that's why we're seeing all the volunteer corn.
What other application things should producers keep in mind when they are going to spray their field?
So as we kind of got to the end of June, we sort of changed seasons here at least in Northeast Kansas. We went from cool weather to very, very hot weather. And clearly that's going to change how we approach our herbicide applications. For some herbicides that have pretty tight environmental restrictions on the label, I'm thinking of like the over-the-top dicamba products. If anybody is still, trying to get those on, we essentially are going to run out of suitable days between the temperature and the wind speed. So we're getting into a tough time. It's been a tough time of year all spring, I think, for our applicators, Shelby. But yeah, we're changing from at least here in Northeast Kansas, changing from battling the rain to battling the wind and battling the heat.
And Sarah, for a little bit of fun today, we always mention weeds that are hard to control or starting clean and staying clean or a lot of things along those lines. But for right now, what is a weed that if you go out in the field and you see it, you know you can spray it and it's going to die?
Ooh, that's a great question, Shelby. I would say maybe small grasses. If we have small grass coming up and we're going to go with a a good rate of Roundup or glyphosate, we should be able to control those well. I mean, as I think about walking even my research plots and the things that we've applied post-emerge that have been 100% foolproof, there's not a lot, Shelby. It's just been tough environmental conditions this year.
I can agree with that. Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State Wheat Specialist Sarah Ganske. If you'd like to read more on this topic, you can do so by checking out a few recent Agronomy E update articles. The first one is titled World of Weeds Pokeweed, and the second one is titled Herbicide Application Cutoffs for Flowering Soybeans. If you would like to check out these Agronomy E update articles for yourself, you can find them by going to agronomy.k-state.edu/e updates. Once again, that is agronomy.k-state.edu/e updates. If you would like to receive these weekly Agronomy E updates to your own email, you can do so by reaching out to K-State's Kathy Gale at her email, which is kgale@ksu.edu. That is kgehl@ksu.edu. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and retired Smithsonian Institution curator Peter Leopold as they discuss how agriculture has been a staple of our nation's commerce and enterprise over the course of its 250 years, according to Peter.
As the nation's forefathers discussed and debated the future of a newly independent country in the 1770s and early 1780s, the conversation about direction included where agriculture would fit in. As retired Smithsonian Institution curator Peter Leopold explains,
there's a discussion about whether it should be an agricultural nation or an industrial nation.
Yet in both instances of ag and industry, they are intertwined, with examples of such found in the innovations that spurred the growth of the USA over its 250-year history. Leopold says one can look at American enterprise through agriculture via a timeline divided into 4 distinct periods. Market opportunity in the nation's first 80 years, the corporate era of the 1860s through 1930s, a 3-decade mid-20th century period of technological efficiencies, and the present era of mass production and advanced innovations. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State's Joe Gerken to discuss pond turnover. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show learning about pond turnover from K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, what is pond turnover?
Yeah, water at different temperatures doesn't mix, and I've been studying water for a really long time, and that doesn't make sense in my brain, but it's true. And so deeper water tends to be a little bit cooler. Water near the surface of a pond tends to warm up, and those 2 layers of water called the epilimnion and the hypolimnion don't mix. And so the deep layer, the hypolimnion, uses up all of its oxygen. And so generally there's not a lot of life down in that lower layer, deeper layer. The upper layer called the epilimnion does have a lot of oxygen because it can exchange it with the environment. A turnover event is when those 2 different portions of the pond mix up. And so you end up, instead of having a layer that has no oxygen and a layer that has a lot of oxygen, you end up with just a little bit of oxygen everywhere in your pond, and that can cause some problems. So I wanted to chat about that today.
How does a pond end up mixing its water that's lower and higher?
Yeah, so what happens is you get something that breaks through those 2 layers. And so something like a thunderstorm coming through is common, where heavy raindrops break through that top layer and starts to mix up the 2 layers. And so once they start mixing up, water starts to move kind of in circles. The deep water moves up to the surface, and the surface is pushed down towards the bottom. And that process is called a turnover event. And when we do that, like I said, the oxygen levels drop, but also we suspend sediments, we suspend nutrients. So a lot of things change in our pond and in our pond water quality.
What are some signs that it's happening?
The pond might get murky overnight, so it might look really muddy, come out in the morning. If there are fish in it, the fish would be gasping for air at the surface, or they would be dead, is the other thing that happens. The pond might start to smell bad because there's not a lot of oxygen, so critters and bacteria, plants that are living in that water can't survive, and so it might start to get a bad smell to it. All things that, you might not know that it's a turnover event, but you would walk out to your pond and you would say, hey, something's not right here. That's a good time to reach out to your local extension agent or reach out to me, and we can kind of figure out what's going on.
Any concerns for livestock?
Yeah, that anoxic water, so water that doesn't have oxygen, can't support a lot of life. And the other thing that it does is there are certain bacteria that can thrive in those environments. So there are some immediate illness concerns. I think the largest concern is that when we have turnover events, we tend to suspend nutrients that have been previously trapped in the sediment, mainly phosphorus, but also some nitrogen can get resuspended into the water. And when that happens, you can have the conditions. This often occurs in the summer. It's warm. You have lots of nutrients that can lead to a harmful algal bloom. So being aware of blue-green algae and the risks associated with blue-green algae is probably the biggest concern of these turnover events.
And what are some of those top risks with this harmful algae bloom?
That's a really good question. And so we get lots of questions about blue-green algae. It's a hot topic that comes up this time of year. And so when we start to see them, they look like bright green paint a lot of times on the surface. And they can create toxins that can be fatal to livestock. And so they can do things like cause seizures in animals. They can cause animals to start acting kind of like zombies and going towards the water. And they can also just cause renal failure and cause the animals to die. So lots of not good things happen with blue-green algae, and ultimately it often ends up fatally for the animal.
Anything people can be doing to hopefully prevent this from happening?
Yeah, a lot of this is a natural process, but there are some things you can do. And so if you have the ability to make sure your pond is deep and maintain it as a deep pond, that can tend to help. Things like keeping the water moving. So if you can add an aeration source that's keeping your water mixed up, that will help prevent a turnover event. There are some things that you can do. It's also just a natural process. And so ponds tend to turn over. Some turn over naturally fairly often, and some don't have it happen as well. So kind of being aware of it, taking some of those steps may help, but it is a natural process that also tends to happen.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.